All right, so we left off talking about taxes and impacts on consumer, producer surplus. We talked a little bit about heavyweight loss. So I'll kind of review some of that and kind of lead us into thinking about who's going to bear more of the burden of these taxes and different ways of looking at this. So I'll tell you right up front, I won't be using the iClickers today. I've got a couple slides that say iClickers. I do similar to what we did before. I'll put up an online quiz where if you're following along what we do in class, those online quiz questions should be very easy today. Okay, so see that pop up after class. And look very similar to the iClicker questions for the slides that say iClicker that we're going to do today. Okay, so this is where we left off. We said if a market was in equilibrium, we're going to have kind of consumer surplus being the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of consumers. So what are those? Right? Well, demand reflects the marginal benefits. The price is the marginal cost of consumers, so it's just the area in between price and the demand curve. For producers, the benefit was the price. Their marginal costs are reflecting the supply curve. So producer surplus was just the area in between that equilibrium price and the supply curve. Okay. Now, when we had, let me see if I can get this to work. There we go. When we had taxes, we said what's going to happen is that we're going to see this decrease in our supply curve, right? Because taxes essentially increase the cost of producers. And now it costs me a certain amount of money to produce every single unit. So after that tax, the new equilibrium point, because where my new supply curve hits my demand curve, that's the price that consumers will pay. Right? So you go pay $4.50 for a pack of cereal. So the producer gets that $4.50. The problem is, right? Well, they already spent $1. So it's almost like you gave them, the consumer paid $4.50. Right? But if we think about the net amount or the price that producers keep, well, they were already, right, just to get that to the market before you even bought it, they spent $1 on taxes just to produce it. Right? So really, how much of that did they get to keep? Well, whatever that consumer paid minus the tax, right? In this situation, $3.50. So here we can think about the equilibrium price. Well, there is no equilibrium price. After the tax is imposed, there's a price that the consumers will pay, right? And there's a price that the producers get to keep, right? And so those two things are going to be different. So we can't keep using the same price to calculate consumer and producer surplus. Now, if we think about consumer surplus, it's going to be kind of the difference between demand and the price consumers pay. And this was for every single quantity, right? So that summation sign we said, it's always kind of just like you're adding up for every single quantity, the difference between the demand curve and the price that these consumers pay. Now, visually, we can calculate that area because it's just going to be a triangle, right? The difference between that demand curve and the price that consumers are now paying. For producers, it's not going to be the price below, it's not going to be the area below the price consumers pay. It's now going to be the area below the price that they're keeping, or kind of like the net benefit they're getting from selling this product. They sold it for $4.50, but it cost them this additional $1 in taxes to produce. So now we're going to look at the producer surplus, the difference between the price the sellers keep and our supply curve. So it changes a little bit, right? Because before we got to use the same equilibrium price to compute both these areas. Now we need to make sure we know that there's a difference in the price that consumers pay and the price of the sellers keep. And the difference between those two should just be what? The value of the tax. We kind of talked about some of these things, a little bit of review. We said, what is that rectangle going to represent here? Well, this is the quantity or the number of units sold. The difference between the price that sellers keep and the price that consumers pay is the value of the tax. So the value of the tax times the number of units sold, that's how much money is going to the government, right? That's tax revenue. Okay. So this is going to be total surplus now. Is no longer just producer plus consumer surplus. When you think about, I'm shorthanding this, total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, not equal. Plus, we want to think about this as kind of government surplus or tax revenue. It's like kind of moves back to where we left off. Talk about some of these things. So what is deadweight loss going to be? Right? We said deadweight loss. What was kind of a way to describe that? So after this tax was imposed,
Wasn't it like the amount of money they would have made if there was no tax?
close, right? So it's not the amount of money made, because when we're thinking about deadweight loss, we're always thinking about deadweight loss for society. Right? So for society, when this market was at equilibrium, total surplus was maximized, right? So deadweight loss, the kind of definition is how much of this total surplus, if we were at this allocated efficient point, how much of it was lost by these taxes being imposed? Well, you kind of could just see, I went back to the visual, it used to be that total surplus was this entire area, so how much was lost, that kind of little triangle there. And another easy way to think about this is, we're basically losing out on the surplus from all the units that we would have sold at equilibrium that we are no longer selling after the tax imposed. So for every unit kind of in this range, how much surplus is being lost? Well, the difference between the supply and demand. So we're thinking about total surplus. Total surplus is just the difference between that supply and demand curve for every single unit sold. Okay. So you've got deadweight loss there. I guess I can work on directions. So before I move forward, any questions kind of at this point? Okay with this for now. Move on.
The projector screen. I can't see the last part of that.
That?
No, the other one. Yeah, there.
Oh, what I wrote on the board.
Yeah.
All right, yeah.
Okay, I got it.
I know, I don't know why they don't have the decimal back.
So in this specific equation,
Mhm.
the deadweight loss would be 350.
Yeah, right, because all you would do is find the area of this triangle. What's the base of your triangle? 250, the difference between 1,000 and 750. What's the height? The height, actually, interestingly enough, using this one, hopefully makes it a little bit clearer. What's the height of your triangle always going to be for deadweight loss when you're dealing with these tax examples? The value of the tax. Notice the difference between that supply and the supply curve plus the tax, where the difference will always just be the value of the tax. Yep. So really, all you have to do, if you want to think about it, you don't have to think about it as the area of a triangle, is what you're going to find, but you could take how many fewer units you sold times the value of the tax and then times a half, right? Or if it's easier, you've got a triangle 1/2 times base times height.
Really, it's 1.5.
Yeah, sorry, I actually, when you asked that, right, the number of units lost is 250 times $1 and then times a half because we're looking at the area of the triangle. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking just of thinking about how many fewer units that we sell there. Yep. All right. So this is kind of, I went backwards instead of forward. So if we remember, here's kind of our total surplus with no taxes. I'll show you an example because you might be thinking about, well, look, you're talking about like me going to buy cigarettes or something that have a tax, but a lot of the time, it's not going to be that the producers are taxed, right? The tax is imposed maybe on the sale of the goods, right? So the producers produce this pack of cigarettes, right? They then go to sell it, and whoever buys it from them pays some price, but then they also have to pay an additional tax. So this actually works something like sales tax, right? There is some price on the good. That's not what you pay. You go to the store, right, and you try to buy, you pay that price plus sales tax. Okay. So a lot of the times we're going to think about it as consumers are going to be the ones who are paying this tax. Right? I accidentally already went forward, so you can kind of maybe already guess what's going to happen. But here, you think about where did the price and quantity start. If the consumer pays the tax, it's almost like whatever my marginal benefit was before, I'm gonna have that same marginal benefit, but I'm now gonna lose out that I have to pay this additional tax. So if we think about the cigarette example, maybe I go to pay $5 for a pack of cigarettes, right? Well, I had some marginal benefit, but now it costs $6 because there's a dollar tax on every pack sold, right? So for consumers, this tax is actually negative, right? Demand reflects marginal benefits. So if I have additional cost that's eating into my benefits, so how much lower, you kind of think about this as being my second demand curve, it's going to be my marginal benefits minus that tax. I kind of ran out of room here, so, right? I can think about that second demand curve was whatever my marginal benefits were minus the value of the tax now. So we think now, where's this new equilibrium price going to be? My new demand curve minus the tax for consumers. Where that hits the supply curve is right here. So notice it still decreases the number of units purchased. And now this, right, this is the price. Sorry, on this one. If I go up to what that marginal benefit is, even though this new demand curve reflects the marginal benefits minus the tax, well, what is the actual amount that the consumer paid? Well, their new benefit is down here, but that benefit kind of took out the tax. They ended up paying actually a much higher amount. So this like new demand curve isn't going to reflect actually how much they pay, it's how much they paid minus the tax. So when we're looking at that, how much do they actually pay at the store? Well, it's however much they valued it, plus the additional value of that tax. So wherever we were at back up on that demand curve, you can kind of think about it here. Well, that's the price consumers pay. They paid $4.50, maybe, right? But how much do the sellers keep? Well, $1 of that amount that consumers paid didn't go to the producer, right? That was taxes that went to the government. So the price that sellers receive would be wherever we're at down here on our supply curve. Well, now notice we still have this difference in the price consumers pay. Excuse me, let me drink the water and I go over there. There's still a difference between the price consumers pay and the price sellers keep. We're still going to end up with the same area as deadweight loss. And in fact, the price that consumers pay and the price that sellers keep would be the exact same. So it doesn't matter if we impose the tax on the producers or the consumers, as long as it's the same tax, right? So if I have a tax of $1 on the producers and it shifts or it decreases supply, right? Kind of shift it by $1 at every quantity, or if I impose it on the consumers, so this additional cost now, is going to decrease demand. How much does it decrease in demand? That same amount by $1, right, at every quantity. I'm going to get the same outcome, right? I'm getting the same new price consumers pay, the same price sellers keep. I'm getting the same deadweight loss. And you can kind of think about here, it looks very similar to what I did before. Consumer surplus, the area above what consumers pay and demand curve, producer surplus, between the price they get to keep and the supply curve. What's in between here? Well, that's just the number of units sold times the value of the tax, so that's tax revenue. And we sold 250 fewer units and calculate the area of that deadweight loss. Any questions on this? So I personally, when I'm asking you questions about taxes, just showed you it doesn't matter if you shift the supply curve or you shift the demand curve, right? Now it's going to decrease the demand curve, but it's also going to decrease my supply curve. But it doesn't matter which one of those I use, I should get the kind of same result, right? That I get this deadweight loss. What I would suggest to you is to always draw it as a decrease in supply. I just think it's easier to think about it that way because, we're talking about taxing, we're adding this additional cost, but demand reflects benefits. So it's like net benefits and keeping the benefits. I just think it's a little bit more difficult to think about as opposed to taxes are additional costs to my producers. So it increases my cost, that supply curve kind of shifts up and to the left, or it's decreasing supply, right? Higher input prices, decreases supply. That's probably the easier way to think about it. But I wanted to show you that, even if you did shift you put the tax on the consumers, if it was the same exact tax that you would have put on producers, you get the same outcome. Okay. Any questions on this? So, what I want to go through here. Okay. I actually have my animations all I have on it. So let's think a little bit about what's happening with taxes, just to kind of understand who's benefiting, who's not. Right? So A here would represent what? So I have this tax. I guess I don't have the line up there on the line. Okay. I should have my new supply curve with the tax up here. All right. Here's the price consumers pay, price that sellers keep, the old equilibrium price and quantity, the quantity after the tax. What would A represent? Consumer surplus, right? First of all, an easy way to think about it is consumer surplus is always that triangle on top. It's not a technical way to remember it, but that's an easy way to remember it, right? And what's the triangle on top? Well, how do I know where to start and stop? It's going to be the difference between the demand curve and the price that the consumers are paying. What would producer surplus be? Well, would add up across every single quantity that we see sold on the market. We're going to take the benefit to producers, so that's the price that the sellers get to keep, and we're going to subtract however much it cost them, right? Or what reflects marginal costs?
$1.
So which of these lines would reflect marginal costs? I usually try to draw it up the one labeling, right? Yeah. So you can think about it as it's really producer surplus is going to be the difference in the price of sellers keep and my supply curve. So that's my new producer and my new consumer surplus, right? A and B there. B and C represent what? Okay. Well, if I go back when I was in equilibrium, where was it? Right here we go. This entire triangle was consumer surplus. So if I think about after the tax, all right, there we go. Area B used to be consumer surplus, right? Back when we were in equilibrium, consumer surplus was the entire area between demand and equilibrium price. So after the tax, area B, consumers lost it, right? We said A was just consumer surplus after the tax. So B would represent consumer surplus that is now surplus for who? Government, right? And C would represent, well, producer surplus used to be the area below the equilibrium price, but above my supply curve. So C would represent what used to be producer surplus is now. So what does this whole rectangle represent? Government revenue. That's, we can break this down into two components. So let me try to draw this out and I'll break this down into something for you. Price, yeah, and supply plus like that. So I can think about here the price that consumers pay, the price sellers keep. So visually, we know this entire rectangle. Well, that's just going to be the number of units sold after the tax times the difference between the price the sellers keep and the price consumers pay. That difference should always just be what? Whatever the consumer pays, the seller gets to take that amount, but they already paid the tax, so the amount that they keep is that much minus the tax, right? Or you can think about it here. If I rearrange this a little bit, so the price that consumers pay is the price of sellers, price the sellers. I'll give you another way of thinking about it. If I take how much people are paying and I subtract the value of the tax, that's how much the producers or the suppliers are keeping. Okay. If I rearrange this equation a little bit so that I move tax either side, I'll show you kind of step by step here. And you don't have to do this every time, it's just a way to think about this. And then I subtract this from both sides. What I end up with is that the difference between the price the consumer pays and the amount the seller keeps, that difference is just the value of the tax. So we know that this rectangle here is the value of the tax times how many units are sold. That should just be government revenue. But we can break this government revenue down into two parts. So I'll get some colors up here. Maybe this will help a little bit. So what we're trying to think about is, before the tax, I had a certain amount, and I'll just draw the original kind of consumer surplus here, just using consumer surplus as my example. So before the tax, this whole area was consumer surplus before the tax, right? After the tax, what is consumer surplus now? Well, we said it's going to be this area here. So what consumer surplus did we lose? This entire area below, which now within here, this represents what used to be consumer surplus, but is now tax revenue. And yep. And what's over here, we can kind of think about, this is now what used to be consumer surplus, but is now part of deadweight loss. So part of consumer surplus that was lost is just gone, right? Because those units are no longer being sold. However, this surplus that consumers lost out on, well, it's going somewhere. Those units are still being sold. It's just that that amount of surplus now is tax revenue to the government. That will clarify a little bit. And I could go through and do the exact same thing. So I could do the exact same thing for producer surplus as well. It's probably hard to put it all in the same graph, so I'll actually draw another one over here. But I think it's worthwhile to kind of understand what's going on here. So if instead we have that exact same graph, you got supply after the tax, we identify the quantity after the tax, equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price, starting out. Before, producer surplus would have been this entire area. After the tax, we know the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps changes. The difference between the two, the value of the tax. So after this tax, new producer surplus, we said, well, they're no longer getting the equilibrium price. They're only getting to keep whatever it was the consumer paid after the tax. So this area here represents producer surplus that they kept, right, after the tax change. I'm trying to line these colors up right over there. This rectangle here would represent what? Well, producers are no longer receiving that surplus. So it's producer surplus that has now become part of tax revenue. So you can kind of see tax revenue, some of it comes from producers, some of it comes from consumers. Right? Both parties are kind of being hurt by this tax. And then what's the only other thing that we had? Well, all this surplus over here, we're no longer selling these units. This is kind of the producer's contribution to deadweight loss, right? Our society overall lost out on some surplus from producers, some surplus from consumers, but then some of producer and consumer surplus were just transferred to the government. Okay. Questions on maybe drawing this out probably a little bit. He's going to try to break these down in different areas. You kind of see B and C here. C was the amount of surplus that producers lost that now goes to the government. B was the amount of surplus that consumers lost that now goes to the government. And then you kind of break down deadweight loss. Area E here would be the amount of surplus that consumers lost, that's now just gone. And F would be the amount of surplus that producers lost, that is now just gone. I lost my marker cap, but that's okay. Any questions kind of on that before we keep moving? So hopefully kind of having these two graphs kind of drawn separately kind of gives us a little bit more of an insight of what's going on after the tax. Surplus is shifting around from producers and consumers to the government. We're also just losing some as well. The next thing we'll talk about is, okay, now that we know, let's see if I can get this here. Part of producer and consumer surplus is going to become tax revenue. In this example, I gave was that we had exactly the same elasticities, and that each producer, or the producers and consumers, lost out equally. Right? They both bore half the burden of the tax. Right? But that's not always the case, and I kind of alluded to this last class, right? But when we say tax incidence, what that really means is who is bearing more of the burden. Okay. So sometimes we'll have that consumers lose more surplus to the government than the producers do, or vice versa. So we're thinking about, we got the price consumers pay, the price that sellers keep. One way that we could measure tax incidence is here. I think the numbers that I had before was 4, 4.5, and 3.5, right? The old equilibrium price was 4. The new price after the tax was 4.5 that consumers paid. Sellers kept 3.5. So here you can kind of think about for consumers, how much more did they pay? Well, the new price they pay is 4.5. The old equilibrium price was 4.5. Right? Let's see if I can write it. For producers, right? Before they were receiving, so we kind of see they're paying an additional half. For producers, they were receiving $4. They're now only receiving 4.5. So they get to keep, forgot my negative sign here. They're basically getting 50 cents less for every unit. You kind of see here, they both bore the burden equally. Producers made 50 cents less, consumers had to pay 50 cents more. But that's not always the case. So you can kind of think about the differences. It's kind of what I had here, right? What the old equilibrium price was. To decide who pays more. But in practice, I'm not going to ask you about that. The way that I'm going to just, what I'm concerned with is that, you know, why might we see something like this, where consumers pay the entire $1 of the tax, but producers pay nothing. So how could that occur? So skip ahead a little bit. I think I've got things a little bit out of whack here. So what do I want to jump to? I don't really want to jump to this, but I think this. Here's what I want to focus. We'll come back to this. I might even wait and do that on Friday. But who's going to bear more of the burden of this tax really depends on one thing. And I said last class this, so we'll see if anyone remembers. What did I say? Who's going to be hurt more by this tax depends on. Might have heard it. Elasticity. Yep. So it's going to be something about the relationship between the elasticity of supply and the elasticity of demand. Okay. If we remember that elasticity means responsiveness, right? Whoever responds more to the price changes that this tax, or the price changes that are a result of this tax, whoever responds more to those can kind of make more optimal decisions. If I don't respond at all, right, I'm going to get screwed, right? And so whoever is going to be more responsive means that whoever is more elastic kind of bears less of the burden. And then whoever is kind of more inelastic, or whoever is not responding, they're going to kind of bear more of the burden. Well, how can we determine who is more or less elastic? What we're really saying is we have two situations, right? Either the elasticity of demand is greater than the elasticity of supply. And here, when I say greater than, this is another reason why we had to take the absolute value when looking at that price elasticity of demand. Because we know that the price elasticity of demand will always be negative, because price and quantity move in opposite direction for consumers, but the elasticity of supply will always be positive. So what we're really thinking about here, if we want to be technical, we're really looking at the absolute value, right? We're just dropping that negative sign, saying who has a larger absolute value elasticity measure. So if consumers or demand is more elastic than supply, who's going to bear more of the burden? So if the elasticity of demand is greater than the elasticity of supply, who is more responsive? I have a greater elasticity. That means I am more responsive to this price change as a result of the tax. So if the elasticity of demand is greater than the elasticity of supply, who is more responsive? Consumers. So who's going to bear more of the burden of the tax? Suppliers, right? If the consumers are more elastic, right? They have a higher elasticity measure. They're more responsive. They're going to avoid the negative outcomes of this tax. And kind of producers, I guess here, kind of bear more of that burden. The exact opposite is true. What if suppliers or producers are more elastic? Well, if the producers are more responsive to this price change that tax occurs, then that means who's going to be hurt? Well, people who are not responding. So there we would have kind of the consumers bear more of the burden. Okay? So another way of thinking about this, just I guess maybe simplifying, whoever has the higher elasticity, they're going to bear less of the burden. Okay? So whoever has the higher elasticity, whoever is more responsive, they can bear less of the burden or avoid the burden of this tax. So we kind of think about here, you can say this in multiple directions. I think I have an example here. Yeah, here we go. Right? So let's say I had some actual measures of elasticity. I go through, I compute the price elasticity of demand. I go through, I compute the price elasticity of supply. The elasticity of demand is higher. That means consumers are more responsive. They can avoid the burden. And then here we would see producers are going to bear more of the burden of that tax. If, for whatever reason, you have the elasticity of supply be greater than the elasticity of demand, well, that's when we'll see consumers bear more of the burden. An example of that, I can compute the elasticity of demand is less than the elasticity of supply. Now, how we compute those, we've kind of already done that, right? So it's like after we calculate those elasticities, then we compare the relationship to see who's going to bear more of the burden of that tax. Okay. And I kind of tried to shorthand this, maybe simplify a little bit more on the board than I did here on the slides. We can do that. Any questions at this point? So I'm going to, what do we have in time? What do I think will be most useful today? So I'm going to have to remember, I want to come back to this slide on Friday. I don't think we'll have time today. If we do, I'll come back to it. But I think looking at this might help make this point of who's going to bear more of the burden a little bit easier to understand. So it's going to be kind of a weird one, but let's say I have perfectly inelastic demand. I've got this on the slide, but I think I want to walk through and try to draw this out and go step by step a little bit more. So let's say I've got perfectly inelastic demand. So if we said that demand was perfectly inelastic, we know that that means demand is going to be this vertical line. Why do we know that? Well, that means perfectly inelastic means change the price all over the place, and I keep buying the same amount. Right? So we then have kind of a regular supply curve. Well, before we even go into thinking about this, so first of all, before the tax, Here's my equilibrium price. What's the elasticity of demand if we have perfectly inelastic demand? So remember, it's the percent change in quantity from a percentage change in price. So what will the elasticity of a perfectly inelastic demand always be? 0. So why would it be 0? It doesn't matter what percent change I put in the price here, right? It doesn't matter what two prices I'm moving between. What is the percentage change in the quantity demanded? 0. If it's always the same, this will be 0 over some number. 0 over any number is 0, right? So we've got an elasticity of demand that's equal to 0. Okay? As long as I don't have perfectly inelastic supply, what has to be true? I can use a value to prove this to myself. Let's say, you know what? Even though it's not perfectly inelastic, supply could be really inelastic. Let's say it's 0.1. If I have perfectly inelastic demand, it doesn't matter how low the elasticity of supply is, as long as it isn't perfectly inelastic, the elasticity of supply has to be greater than the elasticity of demand. Meaning any number is greater than 0. So who's going to bear more of the burden when we have perfectly inelastic consumers? They're not responding at all. So the consumers are going to bear more of the burden. And what ends up being true, we'll kind of show this here in a second, is they bear the entire burden. So before, what was producer surplus here? The difference between the price the sellers keep and that supply curve, right? Or the equilibrium price, because we didn't have taxes yet. So producer surplus was the difference between the equilibrium price and our supply curve, right? That's because our supply curve reflected their marginal cost. Now this is kind of weird, and I wouldn't expect you to know this ahead of time, but what does consumer surplus be here? So usually, this is why it's a little tricky. Usually it's, you know, if I have the demand curve, I've got my equilibrium price, usually it's just that difference between my demand curve and that equilibrium price, right? We had some kind of triangle up there. But if I have perfectly inelastic demand, what's the difference between my demand curve and my equilibrium price? It's actually a rectangle. And that's only going to happen if you have perfect inelastic demand. So it's a very extreme example, but consumers have like a huge consumer surplus here. And if you think about why, what this demand curve is really telling you is that I'm going to buy the same amount no matter what the price. So I'm willing to pay, technically, what price am I willing to pay if I'm perfectly inelastic? Infinite, right? So my surplus is also infinite, right? As long as I can buy this good, as long as I can obtain this good, my surplus is infinite. So after we have this tax, we know that we're going to get this decrease in supply. But notice what's kind of interesting. That new quantity, or equilibrium quantity after the tax, ends up being exactly the same as it was before, right? Because yeah, the tax is going to cause the price to change, but consumers don't care. They're going to keep buying the same amount. So the price that consumers pay is now going to be up here. Well, how much do the sellers get to keep? Well, it's wherever we're at that quantity. Where are we at on my supply curve? We kind of get this weird scenario where the price that sellers keep is exactly the same as it was prior to the tax. But the price consumers pay will be whatever that old equilibrium price was, or the price that sellers are keeping, plus the tax. They're going to pay the entire amount of that tax. Well, think about where's the surplus loss here. So what's producer surplus after this tax? Well, the price the sellers keep still the same as it was before. Producer surplus actually doesn't change at all. What's happened to consumer surplus? Remember, it was the difference between the demand curve and the price they paid. But now the price they paid is up here. You can kind of think about it as new consumer surplus. Is this green area? which means what used to be consumer surplus is now going to become tax revenue or government surplus, right? So all of the tax revenue is coming just from that blue area or just from consumer surplus. So if you kind of start out with the extremes, sometimes it's easier to understand these relationships. If demand was perfectly inelastic, we're going to have that consumers bear the entire burden, right? Or that all of tax revenue is really coming from this lost consumer surplus. Okay. Questions on that? Now, in practice, do we ever have perfectly inelastic? No, but we have pretty inelastic demand. And so it's not that the entire amount is going to come from consumers, but you can imagine, like, what if there was just like a little shift here? Well, that producer, the price of selling barely falls, so they might lose a little bit to the government. Consumers are still going to lose, the majority of tax revenue will come from consumers. But I think if we think about the extremes, at least it kind of helps us remember, oh yeah, if I have perfectly inelastic, the consumers aren't responding at all, they're going to bear the entire burden. So the more inelastic you are, the more the burden that you'll bear. Flip side, and I kind of have the summary here. We've got no deadweight loss, something I failed to mention. Notice quantity didn't change at all, so we're not selling any fewer units. We lost no surplus. Now, is that a good thing? Well, society didn't lose out here, but consumers were really hurt. So this is like really, really inelastic goods, like drugs that people need to live. Well, yeah, we could minimize deadweight loss by just letting the money letting money do it at once. But I mean, if we're taxing something here, we probably don't want to tax like insulin or something, right? Because we're just really just going to be hurting consumers, right? Yeah, we don't lose any surplus, but we're really hurting people. And I think generally as a society, we have a higher value associated with individual or consumer surplus than we do with companies, right? So just kind of a practical sense. Now, this one is a little bit weird. When we get perfectly inelastic supply, right? So there, after I add this tax, it's actually like I see this decrease in my supply curve or this shift left. So we think about, before, where would producer consumer surplus be? This one, I think it's not as strong of a way to remember this, but if I'm at my equilibrium point, here's my equilibrium price, ignore this line for a second, right? Consumer surplus is just this entire area, like the area above the equilibrium price or below my demand curve. As I then see what is producer surplus, this is a weird one. It's going to be the difference between equilibrium price and my supply curve. So it's kind of this lower rectangle here. After I see this tax, right? What's the price that consumers are going to pay? It's actually going to be my new supply curve, and it's that demand curve. So the price consumers pay is going to be a little bit higher than it was before. The price the seller keep is actually going to remain the same here. So if we have perfectly inelastic supply, we kind of get the a weird effect where oh, I started this backwards. Think about this, but let's hold off on this. I have something screwed up here on the way I have it, so I don't like the way that I have that described. I think the best way to think about this, and the reason why I kind of start out with it, is perfectly inelastic demand really can show us that whoever's more inelastic, that's going to be who bears more of it. Where are we at? All right, so one thing, I'm not going to hammer it too much. I just want to mention it as kind of a more practical example. Okay, so we'll kind of pick up here next class. We'll talk a little bit more about tax and 321. So let's say I had something like this, right? Where slope is not synonymous with elasticity. Let's say I had a situation where suppliers were a little bit more elastic. So I know they're more responsive, they should bear less of the burden. I can actually determine that from the price of the product. As we kind of mentioned this before, like we look at the old equilibrium price, and we see that after the tax, the new price that consumers are paying is $2.25. Well, if they're paying an additional 75 cents, Whereas suppliers, they're keeping $1.25 as opposed to $1.50, they're only keeping 25 cents less. So here we would say, who bears more of the burden? Consumers, right? The amount of increase they pay in the price is greater than the amount that producers or greater than the decrease in the amount that the seller got. So you kind of don't have to calculate these surpluses, like I kind of said, you know, that breakdown of tax revenue, maybe it'll go a little bit more to consumers, a little more to producers. You don't have to go through and calculate that necessarily. The probably easier way to do that is look at what the new prices are. Look at what the new price consumers pay, look at what the new price sellers keep, look at the old delivered price, and that'll kind of also help you see who bears more of this burden. So we'll work through some more examples, some equations, but also some kind of more visual graphs next class. And actually, we didn't get as far as I wanted. So I went through the online quiz today. I'm not have to worry about doing anything. I'm gonna get the day, next couple of days off. It's supposed to be hot. Try to stay cool, have some fun today. And I will see you guys on Friday.
Your marker cap, they're just either in the trash can or.
Okay, thank you. I was gonna say, I don't know where it flew off at, but it was somewhere over there, probably. Thank you.